Hey, welcome back to Gold's Garage. So, pretty exciting day for Gold's Garage. Got lots to unpack, some special things to tell you today. Introduction to not only this video, but what's coming up. It's going to be pretty interesting for me anyway. I hope you too as well. So, one of the things you've heard me say on Gold's Garage is you only know what you can measure. And in a previous video, one of my previous videos, I talked about externally piping cooling hoses on an Edelbrock manifold. Hopefully I got the pronunciation right. And that created a lot of interest and a lot of controversy, lots of theories. And you know, there's lots of theories about how things work out there. But if you can't measure it, you don't really know. So, you know, different ways of measuring, of course. Dynamometer is a great way. If you're a circle track racer, your lap times. If you're a drag racer, your ET. There's other ways as well. But we're going to try and do it by putting instrumentation on the engine. So, felt you can come in here and have a look. I'm going to show you what I'm planning to do for measuring. I've installed some pressure and temperature gauges at a couple different points. I actually took a Team G manifold. A Wyand manifold is not piped for external plumbing, so I actually took it off, drilled and tapped, 1/4 inch pipe plugs, pipe threads, installed gauges at the front and back, and some exterior plumbing based on my own thoughts. Does it work? I don't know yet because I haven't tested it, but we're going to find out in a future video. So why don't I do it today? Well, if you notice, there's no radiator. I actually was all excited about doing this. I went to start it up for the test and I got a leak in my radiator. So the radiator's at BS&B Radiator in London, Ontario, getting fixed right now. And I'll get it back in a day or two, and we will do what I just stated. And BS&B, shout out to those guys. They're racers too. They race super modifieds, those wing deals with great big tires and the big block Chev engines hanging off the left side of them. That's what these guys do. They're pretty high-end racers. Anyway, I'll get the radiator back, and we'll do that. And you've often seen me use this tool. It's a laser pyrometer, and it's pretty cool, and I've used it often to measure header temperatures, and I record that, and that's one of the ways that I know, and I've been telling you before. Usually the two hot cylinders in the middle of a small block Chev header are hotter. But today I ordered a thermal imaging camera, which makes this look like a Tinker Toy. So thermal imaging camera will actually, when I shoot it at the engine, will show me a differentiation of 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And I had to get a fairly expensive one because I needed the high resolution. And the other thing is, unless you do, they don't go past 500 degrees. So this one will go over 1,000 degrees. So it'll measure, not just measure header temperature, show you where the hot spots are. And hopefully when we get to do this test, when I get my rad back, we'll have these gauges to show temperatures at key points, but we'll be able to shoot anywhere on the block, intake manifold, or wherever with this camera, and hopefully it's going to tell a tale. Let's see what happens when we get it back. That'll be a future video. I'm also going to do one, what you don't know what you can't measure. So I've got a vacuum gauge set up, and it goes into a port in the block where the fuel pump goes. I've threaded a port in the block where the fuel pump goes. And this is Mike's race engine. Race engines don't usually have PCV valves. Why don't they have them? I don't know why. But we're going to do some tests. So I've installed, that's why the valve covers are different, installed a different PCV valve, and I've installed the external port there so I can measure the vacuum with and without the PCV valve at this point and in the crankcase. Obviously this port goes in right into where the plunger for the fuel pump usually goes right back into the crankcase, so it'll measure vacuum in the crankcase if there is any. So we'll see that on a future video. So the theme of today, or the subject of today, is going to be A good friend, Gary Phelps, sends me information from time to time, and when he saw my video about the external piping on the Edelbrock manifold, he sent me this. It's from the Stewart Water Pumps website. Mike will put a link up in the or a connection in the description to this. So if you just go to their site and click on tips, you'll get everything that I'm going to show you. And I could just tell you to do that, but I'm pretty sure most people aren't going to. So I took the time to look at it all myself, review it, make into a short form so I can give it to you probably a lot faster than you can look at it, because most people probably aren't going to look at it. Now, we also got some props. Got a couple engines to show you to demonstrate what I'm trying to do. Got the hood up in the Camaro for part of the show and tell as well. So let's get into that. Full and open disclosure before I get going on that. There's stuff in here that I didn't know. There's stuff in here I never gave a thought to. And we have a saying in the industry, when you pay a lot of attention to something, it gets better. Well, if everything's working good, you don't pay that much attention. But if you've got a problem with your cooling in your engine, or you want to make it better, there's a lot of stuff here that you need to consider, and stuff that I didn't really think about. There's even stuff in here that I still don't understand, if you want to be honest, and I'm going to get to that in the video. So the other thing before I get going, please like and subscribe and help us out. Our channel is growing nicely. I got a nice perk this morning. I turned on my YouTube channel and there was a Brian Salter Racing Engines video and the subject. And if you watched my channel before, I've mentioned Brian quite a few times. He's got good information on there. He was a supporter of my channel. He started his own channel up about 6 months ago, I think, and he's doing really good. And so the subject of this video is comments on other video channels, and I was honored just to even be included in the comments and included in the same discussion with names like David Vizard and Andy from Unity Motorsports and other guys. I don't have all their names in my head right now, but just to be included with those guys. So thank you very much, Brian. Brian and I both came a little late to the party in terms of YouTube. It's a pretty crowded arena right now, and we got lots of competition. Too bad we didn't start 10 years earlier, but we didn't, and we're both working to grow our channel. So please support Brian's. I sure love if you watch that video as well, and all the rest of Brian's videos as well. So that's the introduction. So we're going to get into the Stewart Racing Pumps, and I'm going to follow through basically what they described. And once again, you can check all this for yourself, but I'm going to give it to you here in the next short little while. So the first couple important, so Stewart Water Pumps sells not just water pumps, they sell all kinds of high performance cooling equipment, racing water pumps, etc. And they're pretty high end stuff. So, and the tech tips I found pretty helpful. So number one thing, and you have to remember this all the way through this discussion, and this was the theme of my first video about this when I talked about the external piping, was heat transfer is equal to delta T, the difference in temperature between the coolant and what it's trying to cool is your delta T, times flow. You need both, remember both those things. To maximize cooling, you need to maximize your coolant flow and your airflow, because the coolant takes the heat out of the engine, the airflow takes the heat out of the coolant. So both are important. So, and that, remember both those principles as we go through. So water pump and pulleys. So that's something I never give a lot of thought to. Whatever the pulleys happen to be, I usually went with them, and it's more important than I thought. So one of the key things is the water pump RPM should at least be as many RPM as the crankshaft, as the engine RPM, okay? And as much as 110% of the engine RPM to a maximum of 7,000 RPM. So If you got an engine going more than 7,000 RPM, then you don't want to be more than 100% because you're going to maximize at 7,000. So that's one important thing to remember. And so I'm going to show you a couple of examples, and I got these engines pulled out for that reason. And so I'm going to put this, I always have a little show and tell. So Michael put a screenshot of this little sketch here. So the water pump RPM, that's your water pump, that's the pulley that's driving it. So the speed of the water pump is a function of the speed of your crankshaft, your main pulley, and the difference in the diameter of the pulleys. So the formula is water pump RPM equals the crankshaft RPM times D1 over D2. So D1 is the crank pulley and D2 is the water pump pulley. So I got two real life examples here to show you, and they are the opposite. So if we start with Trevor's engine, so I still got Trevor's super stock engine here in my shop. So if you look at his, there it is right there. You can see that Trevor's pulley on the crankshaft is smaller than the pulley on the water pump. So that's going to slow the water pump down. So in this case, we take his formula. Let's assume both engines are going 5,000 RPM for the sake of calculating. So 5,000 RPM. So I actually measured the diameter of the pulley. It's just proportional to the diameter of the pulley. So Trevor's pulley is 4.8 inches and the water pump 7 inches. So 5,000 times 4.8 over 7, he's going 34,200 RPM. So he's underdriving. So Trevor is underdriving. And so the water pump's going slower, and this pump's never going to get anywhere close to 7,000 RPM. So here's the other example. This is Paul's 355, and actually these are my pulleys. They've been on at least 30 or 40 engines, more probably. I use over and over. And so in this case, it's the other way around. The crankshaft pulley is bigger than the water pump pulley. So it's going to drive the water pump faster than the engine. So assuming he's going 5,000 RPM again. So I actually measured this pulley is 7 inches and this pulley is 5.5. So 5,000 RPM times 7 divided by 5.5 is 63. So this water pump's going to go 63. And that's okay because this engine is probably going to go 6,000 RPM. That's going to get him pretty darn close to 7,000 RPM on the water pump because it's basically being overdriven. So if you go back to Stuart Water Pump's recommendation, you should be 100% of the speed of the crankshaft, up to 110%, not to exceed 7,000 RPM. So, and you know, I'll say it right here before I go any further. I don't tell anybody what to do. I give you information. You can do whatever you want. And I'm not trying to influence that. But this is information. I got this from Stuart. I didn't make it up. And so I'm just passing on for your benefit. So let's keep going. The next thing is radiator caps. So typically a normal engine that's going to go up to say 200 degrees, according to Stuart, will increase about 16 to 18 psi from ambient till it gets to 200 degrees. So the heat transfer in the system is equal to, once again, I've mentioned this before, okay, the difference. So the higher the pressure, kind of missed that point. The higher the pressure in the system, the better it's going to heat transfer. So your radiator cap should be as high a pressure as your system will stand. If your most stock engines are good to 20 psi or whatever, radiators. Some racing radiators are good to 30 psi. So if you have a radiator that can take 30 psi and the rest of your system's tight enough, then you should be going 30 psi as well. So once again, the higher the pressure in your system, the better it's going to transfer heat. So a radiator cap is also a safety valve, right? If the pressure gets too high, it'll lift and let the pressure out so that you don't have you know, at some point you are going to damage the engine if you don't, or the system somewhere, if you don't relieve it, okay? So here's the next thing. The radiator cap should always be located at the highest point in the system and on the suction side, or the low pressure side of the radiator. I'm going to give you a little demo. I got the hood up on the Camaro. Cross flow radiators are better because that's where the cap is. It's on the low pressure side. It also makes it easier for the air to separate from the coolant. So let's look at the Camaro. I got the hood up for that reason. So this is a cross flow radiator, so there's no tank at the top. If it was a downflow radiator, the tank would be at the top. And most modern radiators nowadays, I believe, are cross flow. So the water goes into the radiator coldest on the suction side, pumped through the engine, it comes back here, it's the hottest here, transfers across the radiator to this tank. Now, the cap being on this side is, this tank is connected to the suction side of the water pump. So that reduces the pressure, it lessens the chances of popping the cap, and it allows air, because there's less pressure at this point, it's easier for the air to escape from the water at this point. So that's ideal. If you don't have that, if your cap is in the tank, or your cap is connected to the pressure side of your pump, then you should have a remote tank, a remote fill tank overflow, like lots of modern vehicles have, okay? So that's the ideal setup according to Stuart, and of course I think most people agree that is what I think most modern setups are. So so if it isn't the highest spot, if your radiator cap isn't the highest spot, you should have a surge tank. You should be using a surge tank. One of the other things is saying mounting the thermostat, mounting the cap above the thermostat is not recommended. Listen to that carefully. And I'm going to show you an example where a lot of these things are wrong. Once again, if your system's working fine and you got your engine's cooling fine and you don't have a problem, don't go changing everything around just because of this, okay? Think it through. If you need to do something, if you have an issue, then you need to address it. So here's the next thing that's going to surprise a lot of people, because it surprised me, because we do it. We've always done it. Stuart strongly recommends not to use a restrictor in the thermostat location. Now, the thinking about that is, and typically I've always used a restrictor in my race cars. Trevor's engine's got a restrictor in it, and the thinking is it slows the flow down, keeps the water in the block longer, so it has more time for it to absorb heat. And if you go back to the premise, heat transfer is equal to delta T times flow, two things are wrong. You're restricting the amount of flow, so you shouldn't be. And as you keep heat in the block, water in the block, the temperature increases. The more it increases, the less heat it's absorbing. The bigger the difference between the coolant and what it's cooling, the more it's absorbing heat. The closer they get, as that coolant gets, as long as your coolant is still liquid, and I'm going to show you a little chart based on pressures. As long as your coolant is still liquid, it's absorbing heat. But the hotter the coolant gets, the less that delta T is, the less heat it's absorbing. So there's one to think about, because that, I'm pretty sure that if you went to an APC race and took the thermostat housing off of every car there, they'd all have a restrictor. Mine had a restrictor. Trevor's has a restrictor. And so that was a surprise, but when I think about it, it makes complete sense. Maximize the flow, and it'll maximize the heat transfer. Okay? Stuart makes high-performance thermostats where you need to use a thermostat. Typically, race cars don't use thermostats. Street cars should use a thermostat. They have high-performance thermostats which has internal bypasses in them, so that their claim is their thermostat is not a restriction to flow. That's their claim anyway. So the more flow, the better. So we're back to T1 minus T2, right? So So let me give you an example. Here's our race car. I just mentioned three things that are wrong with it. The pump is underdriven instead of overdriven. It has a restrictor, and the thermostat is located above the cap is located above the thermostat. Three things, according to Stuart, that are wrong. Yet this engine runs 170 degrees. I get Trevor to tell me every caution. 170 degrees all day long, wide open throttle, making maximum horsepower and hitting the chip, and never have an issue. And without even any fan at all. No electric fan, no mechanical fan. I get him to turn the fan on during cautions only. How does he get away with that? Well, it's got 100-mile-an-hour air coming in through the grill, going into the radiator, cooling the radiator down, and that is not a problem. So once again, theoretically, this is a race engine. There's at least three things wrong with it, and yet it's not a problem. And I doubt even if Trevor does watch this video, he's going to change anything. So keep that in mind before you start changing everything around, okay? So where are we at here now? Fans, okay? Well, as far as coolant goes, water is the best coolant, according to Stuart. A lot of those magical things that people sell you to put in your water don't work. The only thing about water is, of course, it can promote rust, so you should have something in there to prevent it from rusting. Water is the best coolant, and the more you put, even if you have to use antifreeze in your coolant, use only as much as you need to protect your engine against freezing, and no more than that. So the more water is, the better the coolant's going to be. Okay, subject of fans. Electric fans are better than mechanical fans. The other thing I'll say about a mechanical fan, because I've used both, one thing about a mechanical fan, you know it's always turning, right? And however, there are other problems with it. At 6,500 RPM, according to Stuart, mechanical fan uses about 18 horsepower. And if you have a really high RPM engine, you may have other problems if you rev a high mechanical fan up 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 RPM. So where possible, electric fans are better. Hoses. Here's another one that's going to surprise you, because Mike's engine, when it was in the race car, had a real nice braided AN hoses with AN fittings on it. I forget what size they are. And their recommendation, use standard OEM rubber type hoses, because AN stainless steel hoses restrict flow. They're smaller on the ID for the same nominal size, and they restrict flow. So that's another thing that's we've been doing wrong, I guess. Let's put it that way. So radiators. Aluminum radiator will dissipate better than a copper radiator. Thicker radiators are better than thinner radiators. There is a little bit of an efficiency loss. I had a viewer ask me a question recently on this subject: is 4-inch better than 2-inch? And my answer was yes, but not twice as good. Well, I should have gone a little further than that. The loss, because you have a thicker radiator, is harder for the air to flow through the radiator. Okay, so but that loss is only about 10%. So is a thicker radiator better? If you need it to get the cooling area, definitely need to use that. Cross-flow radiators, already mentioned that. External plumbing. Okay. One of the things that I didn't think about too much is with aluminum heads, because aluminum, the tensile strength of aluminum is about a third of cast iron, so it's not as strong. So in order for it to make the head as strong, the cross-section of all the chambers in the head have to be thicker. For that reason, there's less room for the water or coolant to flow through the head. So for that reason, aluminum heads dissipate heat better, but they create another problem because there's a restriction to flow. So Siamese cylinder ports are a problem on small block Chevs, because the two, I've pointed out here on this side because Alex over here already. If you have a small block Chevy, you already know this. The two center cylinders on both sides, the exhaust ports come right together. Whenever I scan headers, I scan them about a half an inch away. with my laser pointer. And these two cylinders are almost always the hottest two cylinders for that reason. And because there's less room for flow. So let's go back to my rest of my notes here. So, you ready for this? Stewart recommends 2-10 AN lines from the rear of the intake to the thermostat housing. So that's 2 videos ago. One of the themes of my video was, I don't know why you're doing this because it doesn't really help. Well, Stewart recommends it. If you go back to that video, what I've got on here is a different scenario, and we're going to see whether this has any merit. This is R&D, guys. I'm just trying it out. I don't know how it's going to work, but the comments I made was that you shouldn't do that. You don't need to do that. And Stewart says I'm wrong. So to be honest, I still don't quite understand it. But when I get my thermal imaging camera, hopefully I'm going to be able to scan the heads and the cylinders and see whether Stewart's right or I'm right. I don't know yet, to be honest with you. They also recommend 10 AN lines from the water pump to, there's a place inside of just below the Siamese cylinders where you can tap in and put coolant into that port to cool, because that's the hottest spot where an engine will typically fail if it's overheated, and that's probably the hottest spot on the cylinder heads. We'll confirm that. So 2-10 lines at that point. And Brian commented on my previous video saying that, my discussion was, should you have these external lines from the back of the manifold to the front? That was only half the deal. If you're going to do that, then you also need a pressure line to those Siamese ports in the cylinder head. So that totally makes sense to me. That's the hottest part of the engine, and pumping cold water, cooler water, more flow into that location should definitely help. And that's one thing I'm considering doing on Mike's engine before it goes back in the car. That's, like I said, this is kind of an R&D project, and I got lots more testing to do. So we're getting near the end, guys. So there's 2 key points. We will follow up on these points when we do the testing and see what we can find out. So in a typical engine, and this is something that did surprise me, the inlet temperature in the rad into the engine, let's say when it's at 180 degrees, if that's at the bottom of your radiator, on the delivery side, out of the engine and back into the radiator, there's only 190 degrees. So only a 10 degree difference in temperature between the inlet and outlet, which kind of surprised me. So one of the things that's kind of overwhelming when you think about it, if I mentioned before, about 70% of all the energy in the fuel goes into heat. So there is actually a way to calculate the volume of the water and the change in temperature of the water, an equivalent amount of horsepower. So if you have a 500 horsepower engine, the amount of horsepower that goes into that water is more than 500 horsepower. That's a lot. Think about that for a minute. Coolant flow in a typical system is about 100 gallons per minute. Now, Stewart claims that they're high-performance water pumps. Some of them are as much as 180 gallons a minute, but typically, just to give you a concept, 100 gallons a minute, try that with your garden hose sometime. So, what is reverse flow? A lot of guys commented on my previous video when I talked about the hoses from the back. And of course, Smokey Unick was one of the guys that pioneered this. Chevrolet made some engines with reverse flow. What's reverse flow? So typically the water is pumped from the pump into your block and then comes out of the heads back to this point here where it goes back into the radiator. Reverse flow is the opposite, where you pump it into the heads first, and the heads are the hottest spot, and it comes out of the block. So reverse flow, instead of coming to the block first and then to the heads, goes to the heads first and then to the block. And we're not doing that. I guess there was, I'm not really up on all, there was a lot of R&D done on that. Chevrolet did make some reverse flow engines. So I mentioned before that water, the boiling point of water changes as the pressure increases. So 212 Fahrenheit is the point where water turns into a vapor. But as the temperature increases, or pressure increases, at 10 psi, it's 239. At 20 psi, it's 259. And at 30 psi, it's 273. So if you have a 30 psi cap, water in your rad, in your engine, could be as high as 273 degrees. It's not boiling, it's still a liquid, it's still transferring heat from your engine to the liquid. But the hotter it gets, the slower that transfer rate is going to be. One last point, grill opening. So a radiator, the only radiator I have right now, because mine's in the shop, is the one in the car. So the effective area of the radiator, when you take the thickness of the fins and the cooling lines and all that stuff out, is about 1/3 of the cross-sectional area of the radiator. So if you take length times the width, I think this is about 30 by 17, this radiator, whatever that number is. 1/3 of that is the area where the air transfers through. So if you want to cool your radiator, the opening that goes into it, okay, in this case, this is the grill of a car, but if it's a race car, we actually calculate the size of that opening to make it just enough, because we don't want any more air than necessary going through the motor engine, because we want it to go over the hood of the car and help our aero. So we want that to be as little as possible. And so for that reason, you calculate that area, it should be at least 1/3 of the cross-sectional area of your radiator. The opening, if you got a hot rod or a race car or whatever, the opening that is allowing the air to get to the radiator should be at least 1/3. To be safe, I would go to 1/2 and leave it at that. So since we're talking about cooling, I got a war story for you. If somebody, I always have war stories from time to time, and this one has got a point. So in 2017, we were racing pro late model, and hopefully I'll get Mike to put a screenshot up of our car. My son was driving it. Trevor used to drive it as well, sometimes depending who's available. And we were at a track away in the traveling series. And he qualified really well near the top, and he started near the front and got the lead in the race. And prior to that, when we qualified, just to describe how we do it, for qualifying back then, it was a 2-lap qualifying, and we were allowed to tape up the grill, and it was a hot day. So we would tape the grill up, knowing the engine is going to get pretty hot, but it's only going to go 2 laps. So he qualified really well, and then the cars get impounded after qualifying, and you can't touch them. If you touch them, you start at the back. So we didn't even know it. It probably puked out a little bit of water because it got overheated. So Mike gets in the race. He gets the lead. His old man spotting him, and every time he comes around, "Hey Dad," he's telling me on the radio, "it's 230, it's 240, it's 250. And I kept telling him, "Keep going, Mike, don't stop," because that was about a $10,000 mistake. He lasted about 8 laps at the lead, and then the engine started to slow down, and white smoke was coming out of the exhaust, so that was a pretty good sign it was over. And there's a point to this. So he pulls off, and because I was up in the spotter's stand, it took quite a long time to get down there. And when I got down to the car, I turned the gauges on, and the oil was still 300 degrees, half an hour after it happened. And I took that engine apart, and the failure was, and which is typical, we just talked about that hot spot right in there. The head gasket between the middle cylinders on one side failed, and now I got compression and water transferring across, water getting into the combustion chamber. That was the failure, but I took that engine completely apart and inspected it. Cylinders weren't scored. The crankshaft and bearings were in excellent condition. Uh, the heads were still in excellent condition, except one of them got etched a little bit where the heat got transferred. So I welded that head up, or had it welded up, aluminum welding. Put it back on, rebuilt that engine. I changed rings and bearings and put it back together, and that engine's still running around here somewhere. I sold it 10 years ago, almost 10 years, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. So that's a war story. That was a $10,000 mistake on my part. And you know, one of the other points is usually the driver's too dumb to slow down when he's got the lead, but in this case it was this old man. At least I'm the one that was paying the bills anyway, so I guess it made sense. But if you knew back then there was 40 cars showing up for those races for 28 starting spots, if you knew how hard it was to get the lead, you might understand. But anyway, I'll share that little story with you for what it's worth. Don't do that. It's expensive. And I certainly would never do it again. Sure ruined what could have been a nice day. So hope you found that interesting. I keep forgetting to tell you, please like and subscribe. We got lots to come. The next video we'll have the rad back in. We'll be doing all this testing with our thermal imaging camera and find out whether some of my theories make sense or not. Thank you for watching Gold's Garage.